appreciate your timeliness and being on time. I'm sure there'll be some other folks that will join us here shortly. But I've asked to kick off the meeting, I've asked Robbie Crozier, for those of you who don't know Robbie, he is with Shelter Mortgage. And Robbie has been in the mortgage business for a million years.
22 to be exact, but yeah.
And so I've asked him to join us today because they've got some great programs that I spoke with another shelter loan officer with late last week. And so I'm going to turn this over to Robbie to him to talk, because one of the bigger challenges we have today in the market is, of course, interest rates. We're still short on inventory. The supply and demand factor is still not centered, but we still have a lot of resistance because of the interest rate. So Robbie, why don't you tell them a little bit about one of the programs that you guys have that might assist them in getting more buyers under contract?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to be here with you guys today, and I appreciate the opportunity. And as Tom said, that's, no matter we're in the mortgage side or the real estate side, we're all fighting that conversation, right, about interest rates and how high they are and how much it has moved the needle on monthly mortgage payments for clients. And so for sure, part of that conversation is making sure that buyers are aware that there are multiple ways to help the situation. Now, we don't have a magic bullet. Nobody does. Interest rates are what they are, right? But a couple of things that have been really helpful for us, and we've seen literally get buyers off the fence. That's what we're all looking to do, right? Is get buyers off the fence or get sellers off the fence to get their home on the market. We need more inventory, right? And so a couple things to mention to you guys, along with the normal products that we all have. There is a really, really good first-time home buyer program in the market right now that we've closed a bunch of just since this spring when it rolled out. So it's a $3,000 closing cost credit, period, at closing that the first-time home buyer gets. It's available for all of Metro Atlanta. So there's not a zip code that I have to plug in. In some communities it works, some it doesn't. It's good for the entire Metro Atlanta market, even extending out into, Barrow County and, even some of the fringe Metro Atlanta market. Only one borrower has to be a first-time home buyer. So if you've got a husband and wife and they're actually selling a home and it's in his name, but the wife hasn't had a mortgage or vice versa, it still works as a first-time home buyer program. And then lastly, it does have an income cap, but it's a really high cap, at the highest I've ever seen for these programs. It's about $144,000 annual income for that cap here in Metro Atlanta for borrower or borrowers who are on the loan. So just a great program. And lastly, the interest rates are a little more attractive on the program. Nothing dramatic, but the credit score adjustments that we have to apply to a traditional conventional mortgage don't have to be applied to this program. So if a first-time home buyer has good credit but not great credit, they're 700 or 720, we're going to still be able to get them the same interest rate as the highest bracket of 780 or higher that is out there now. So lots of reasons to look into this if you have a first-time home buyer, because it's just a really great way to kind of lessen the pain of interest rates as well as the cost to get the mortgage. So I'm going to pause and see what questions there are before I get into another scenario. Anybody have any questions on that?
I do, Robbie. This is Barbara Dyer.
Hi, Barbara.
You'll start to find out I usually always have a question or two.
Hey, that's okay.
My question, I heard you say that even if one spouse has a house to sell and the other one is a first-time home buyer, they can still qualify as first-time home buyers.
That's right.
Will they still be able to use the income for both?
Yes, they can both. We can use both incomes. Again, we have to make sure they don't exceed that cap, that $144,000 annual cap. That's a high cap. That's $12,000 a month right there. But yeah, as long as one is not owned a home. And by the way we define first-time home buyer in the mortgage industry is having not owned a home anytime in the last 3 years. So even somebody who's owned a home 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, they are still considered a first-time home buyer if it's not been in the last 3 years.
I just wanted to make sure that that person that just sold their house, because they gonna be owning a house within 3 years. But the other spouse is the first time home buyer, so that's what allows them to still qualify. That's a little different. Is it not, Robbie?
It is a
Most
little
of them,
different. Yeah.
okay, that's a really big plug for sheltered mortgage.
Yeah, it's a, like I said, it's the most favorable. It was almost when it rolled out in the spring, we're like, wow, this is almost too good to be true. But I think I've closed 9 of these already since April. So we're closing them. The buyer does need to go through a phone call, home buyer counseling call. It's about 30 to 45 minutes. As part of that's kind of the only catch, hey, are you willing to spend 45 minutes on the phone for $3,000? That's a pretty easy answer, right? And the feedback from all of my clients has been, that was actually pretty helpful. They went through a few things about my budget and utilities and kind of educated me. So even that has had positive feedback from my clients.
And if they've taken a class from another organization, can they just send you their certificate and will that take care of the 45-minute call, or is that still a requirement?
It's still a requirement, and I do believe, I haven't had that question yet, Barbara, but I think it does have to be through this particular, it's a nonprofit that's actually providing the funds. I'm sure there's some government backing in here too, but the nonprofit is providing the funds and the nonprofit is the one that sends the certificate to us. So I think they would need to go through it again with a nonprofit that handles this for us.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
You got it. Any other questions on that program? All right, well, the other thing just to mention, oh, sorry, does somebody have one?
Yeah, Robbie, what is the nonprofit that they must go through in order to qualify for this program?
The company called Green Path, and we have to set that up. They can't just go through it and then call me. They actually set it up. They have to go through a pre-screening with me on the phone where we tell them the property address and the income figure underwriters come up with. Then they say, yeah, you're good to go. And then they schedule that home buyer call. So it's kind of nothing they can do ahead of time. And that's fine too, because it's good to have that information fresh a week or two before closing, that home buyer education fresh in their minds a week or two before closing.
So this is something that is done after you have a property under contract, or
correct,
or is this part of the pre-approval? I'm confused.
It's after we're going to pre-qualify them like normal. Nothing's going to change on that. We're going to pre-qualify the client, go through numbers and crunch payments and make sure the price range that they're looking in fits with where they want to be and what they qualify for. So when we issue that pre-approval letter to you, we've already done all that. But then we're saying, oh, by the way, you're a first-time home buyer, and we have this program if you're interested to sit on a 45-minute home buyer call to get a $3,000 closing cost credit. And of course, they're always like, yeah, sign me up for that.
Right.
So that's, yeah, so we do it after they go under contract. Now, I do have access to their website where I can, if the property is kind of on the fringes of the Metro Atlanta market, I can still go in there and search and make sure that property is inside the market where they qualify for that. So I can do that ahead of time as you're looking at properties if they're in some of those fringe counties. But I mean, all of Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, you have nothing to worry about, and especially the inside, perimeter, or even outside the perimeter.
What about Henry? Fayette?
Fayette, yes. I think I've already closed one in Fayette. I'm not positive about Henry. I know Rockdale. I closed one in Rockdale. I can definitely, if you want to send me an email with an address or two, I can pop that in. I have to have the actual full address, but if you see a listing or two that your client may like, send me an email with the address and I can look that up really quickly for you.
Okay.
All right. Well, the other program to mention, I'm sure you guys have already heard this. It's from some lender somewhere, but it's just worth revisiting because this also has been a game changer for people to buy when they wouldn't have, and it's the temporary buy down mortgage. It's been around for decades. This is nothing new, but the temporary buy down is the best vehicle to really help ease the pain of these higher interest rates. So the way the temporary buy down works, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, is that the buyer is able to get, in the most common version at least, a 2% lower interest rate the first year and a 1% lower interest rate the second year. So using some round numbers here, if the 30-year fixed rate is at 7% today, then in year one, they make payments at 5%. That moves the needle by far more than any other loan program out there. It's hundreds and hundreds of dollars lower that first year. Then it bumps to 6% in year two. So payments, literally 13 through 24 are based on 6%. And then if they haven't refinanced during those first 2 years, they're going to then assume that 7% rate starting in year 3. The logic behind this is, and I really do subscribe to this theory, is that lower interest rates are coming. I mean, we are at multi-decade highs of interest rates, and they're up there because of the high inflation numbers and the strength of our economy. And there are some very strong signals out there that that's going to come to a halt next year, that a recession, nobody wants a big recession, but even a minor recession wouldn't be a bad thing compared to all the awful inflation we've been dealing with. And mortgage rates love an inflation. I'm sorry, they love a recession. And once inflation is behind us, you know, that's the expectation. There's some other signals I could go into about debt rising with U.S. households and line of credits, home equity line of credit balances rising. So there's some very clear signals that although our economy is very resilient, I'll even use the word that we're maybe stubborn as Americans, we keep spending our money, right? That party is going to end at some point, and history kind of bears that out. And so if you subscribe to that theory, that lower interest rates are coming in the next year or two, then the buy down really does, you know, give you that temporary relief the first year or two on the payment. A lot of relief when you think of a 2% lower rate. Now the catch is that really, for it to be effective and work, the seller has to be willing to pay those buy down funds at closing. And I realize that that's not going to work in every situation. If you've got a buyer looking to buy a home in a very hot area, you know, the home just got listed this past weekend, it's very aggressively priced, the seller is probably not going to be interested, at least to begin with, in contributing $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $10,000 towards the buy down. So I realize it won't fit every situation, but you may also have noticed that there are multiple listings around town that have already mentioned in the listing that the seller is willing to contribute to a buy down. Some of our more savvy agents around town have already realized, hey, there's some real value here. Maybe I have a unique home or whatever the situation, I need to include that in the FMLS wording. And so we'll see that sometimes in the listings where the seller is already agreeing to contribute the money to do the buy down. The reason the seller has to contribute it is because we're really kind of shifting money around. So if the buyer pays that buy down fee at closing, they're not saving any money. They're just paying at closing what they could have paid over the next 2 years at those interest rates. So you really want and need the seller or builder to pay the buy down funds. But I can't tell you guys how many times I've had that conversation with a buyer during the pre-qualification stage and just light bulbs go off like, why wouldn't I do this? I mean, why would I not pay 2% lower in the first year, 1% lower the second year? I'm all about refinancing, you know, when the rates drop. So it like I said, I can tell you multiple stories of clients who are like, I can't afford to buy now. And then 3 minutes later, I can afford to buy now if I do a temporary buy down. So just be aware of the power of that for your buyers. And if you have a tricky listing or a seller, you know, I can walk them through the math and help them, you know, word it correctly in the listing so that they attract more buyers by offering to do the buy down. So questions on that?
Hey,
I've
can
got
I
a
just make a
question.
comment, Robbie,
Yeah.
before questions? Guys, this is a great listing tool to explain to your sellers in markets that are not that are a little bit slower with days on the market. Okay, like y'all know I live in historic College Park, and the market there is really, really quiet. This is a great opportunity for sellers in that area to participate in buy downs, especially if they've already moved and they want to, you know, get their house sold quickly. That's an option that you should discuss in your listing presentations.
Yeah, definitely agree. Questions about that?
I had a question on average on a home that is about 350 or 400, what would be the cost for a 2-1 buy down?
So part of the math is going to be dependent on the loan amount. So, you know, the less they put down, the more they borrow, the higher the buy down cost. So, you know, I'll just say, let's say we have somebody doing, you know, 5% down. That's probably your worst case scenario, right?
Right.
I'm on a calculator right now. So 400,000 sales price, 5% down. The buy down is going to cost around $9,000. So that's what the seller would need to contribute, is around $9,000. And if you got a situation where the sellers, it's been on the market for a little while, and now they're having conversations with you about, hey, should I drop the price? If you take that say $10,000 and drop the price $10,000. I know that's not a market we're in, but we may get into that here. The fall and the winter, things are slowing down, right? And so you may be getting into those conversations about, should we drop the price? Well, $10,000 is only going to move the needle about 55 or $60 a month on their payment. So it helps, it adds up. But if they can take that $9,000 or $10,000 and apply it to a buy down, now we're talking, I can go back to my calculator here, but in that same example, the payment's $494 a month lower the first year. So $500 lower for the first year and $250 for the second year. You better believe that puts more buyers into the market to buy this house.
Yeah, and that can also be a negotiating tool, Joel, that you could talk to your seller about, that maybe, if we offer that, maybe we hold off on repairs. There's a lot of negotiating that you can do, but I think for you as a real estate professional, it really makes you look very intelligent, because I guarantee you your competition's not talking about this.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, guys, so with this 2-1 buy down on the example that Joe just gave, and Robbie, you said they would need about $9,000 to buy that rate down. So for the buyer, with their 5% that they have to bring, now they have to basically cover their own closing costs as well, am I correct?
Yeah, that's a true statement. There's going to be a max as to what you can get out of the seller, right? And I was about to say that there's no special stipulation needed here. This is just closing cost money, and it's up to the buyer how they use it. So when you're filling out contracts, you're not writing anything extra other than just filling in that blank on page 1 about how much money is being contributed towards closing costs. You got to reach out to me to do the math and know what that number needs to be, sure. But other than that, there's nothing special about, contract amendments or special this or that. It's just closing cost money. But to your point, yes, if you're going to use that $9,000 from the seller to do a buy down, then the buyer is going to need to come up with their closing costs, which if they're a first time home buyer, we can get them into that $3,000 closing cost credit too, and combine these two programs into one, which is even better.
Thank you, Robbie.
Yep. Any other questions on the buy down? And I think maybe just the big takeaway here is, when you're having those conversations around the barbecue on a weekend and people are lamenting, how high rates are at, I think it's a really positive response of, hey, real estate's still transacting all the time, buying and selling. And there are some very good ways to mitigate this cost. And, call my favorite lender here and they'll walk you through, what some of those ways are. So we're kind of shifting the conversation away from the negativity to, hey, there's still some great ways, and it's still a great time to buy and a great time to sell.
And just to point out something else that I mentioned to my clients during this process, because I think the 2-1 buy down is a great way to get them in there. And they're looking at their situation as of today. And I always remind them that in 2 years, your lifestyle is going to change. Children are going to grow up. Somebody's probably going to graduate. Your income, you get a cost of living raise every year. So things change in those 2 years, which will probably be more favorable to you when you get to that point.
Yeah, I would think so. Back to the conversation about probably some lower rates coming along. They're still predicting rates in the 5s by the end of next year, which would definitely be a refinance market. That'd be a 1.5% lower than we're at now. I should also mention on that buy down that $9,000 in our scenario. So let's just hypothetically say we fast forward a year and next September, that buyer has been in the home for a year and now rates have dropped and they want to refinance. And of that 9,000, it's like a subsidy. So we've used about half of it, right, to supplement their payments. There's a balance remaining in that buy down account, and that's their money. They get that back. So they're not leaving that on the table. If there's, $4,000 left in that subsidy account, when we do the refinance, we just credit that to their payoff, and their payoff is $4,000 less. So it's really a win-win. That money comes from the seller at the closing table, and they're going to use all of it one way or the other, whether they stay in the buy down for the full 2 years or whether they refinance and we credit that buy down money to their payoff. So it's hard to see any drawback to doing this, except for having to find a seller that is willing to participate. Well,
Okay,
Tom,
any other
anything else?
questions for Robbie before we move on?
Was there anything about condos, Tom, that you wanted me to address, or is that for another call?
You can address it.
Yeah, we had just, had a conversation. I don't know how often you guys work in the condo world, but about a special stip. So you all probably know that, while the lender is approving a loan for a condo, we're kind of simultaneously approving the loan for the borrower and approving the condo community to make sure that they are compliant with the Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac guidelines and eligible condo. Most of them are, but there's some tricky ones, and sometimes they can be eligible, and 6 months later something happens where they're not eligible. And so we found that there is some value in including a very simple worded special stip that Tom can send out in the contract that basically says that the earnest money overrides the, I think I've actually got it pulled up here. What we recommend, it says, to meet Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac underwriting guidelines, the property must receive condo approval. If the condominium is not approved, buyer may terminate this agreement with all earnest money refunded. And there's no date on that. So we're still obligated to get the loan approved by the financing date, get the appraisal done. But if we have a HOA that's not very communicative, which happens a lot,
The big challenge.
it's a big challenge, yeah. Or there's things we have to uncover during that process, and we uncover a big red flag. Well, your buyer wants to know about it too. They don't want to buy a condo in a community that's got some major skeletons, right? And so this allows them to get their earnest money back. The game has just ramped up further and become that much more difficult. You guys all probably recall a little over 2 years ago, the Champlain Towers condo collapse in Florida. Tragic situation that cost over 100 lives. But boy, it really got the attention of the mortgage industry big time. And so now we have to make sure there's no deferred maintenance on a condo. So there are other things that we have to do that we didn't have to do before that have just made the process that much harder. So we're getting condos closed. I don't want to make it sound like you can't buy a condo. We're getting them closed, but to protect your buyer and to buy time, so there's not all this pressure of having to get all these docs figured out in 10 days or 14 days. We highly recommend that you include that special stip on any condo that you make an offer on with the buyer to allow them to have time to make sure the condo is approved, regardless of how communicative or not the HOA is. So I know that's a lot of information. Hopefully that resonates, and what questions do you guys have about that?
Can we get that special stip sent to us? The verbiage?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll send it out.
You'll see some other special steps out there that are real wordy and even have time frames on them, but I say just keep it simple and make it clear that there's no time frame. There's still a finance contingency, but this time frame, for the condo approval overrides and allows the buyer to get their earnest money back if the condo is not approved in time.
Yeah.
Extra layer of protection.
I think that's a
Yeah.
great stipulation.
Say that again.
I think that's a great stipulation.
Yeah.
All right, Robbie. Well, I appreciate you coming on board with us today and sharing all this information. Guys, any more questions before we move on? Good. Got about 30 minutes left, and I've got some topics I want to talk about. So we appreciate you, Robbie.
Okay, guys, I'm going to clock out. So we'll see y'all later. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You got it. Bye-bye.
All right, guys. I talked last week in Decatur at their team meeting, and lenders and closing attorneys are your best friends right now. And I know you all, this is not a plug for Robbie by any means, or Shelter Mortgage by any means, but choosing, even if you're a listing agent, you need to be paying particular attention to who is doing the loan for the buyer, whether you're a buyer's agent or a listing agent, because they can either make or break your transaction. So we want to make sure that we choose wisely. And if you're a listing agent and you don't have any experience with the lender that is on the approved list, you certainly have the right to challenge that and negotiate that, because at the end of the day, we all just want to get to the closing table. All right, we're going to move on. I have two topics that I wanted to share with you guys today. And then, of course, anything else that you want to talk about is always welcome, and don't be shy. So the first thing I want to talk about, and these are issues that I'm having a lot of issues with as the qualifying broker. And that's what I like to share with you guys to let you know from my perspective what's going on in my world as a broker. And so the first thing is fraud. And I've dealt with multiple instances where we either have a fake seller who has claimed to be the seller of a particular property and come to find out they're not. This is generally with vacant lots, lands, or vacant homes. So just be aware that that's going on. We have had instances where we represented what we thought was the seller, and it wasn't the seller, almost to the closing table, and almost ready to wire funds to this person who was not the seller. And we also had an instance where we had a buyer who had a property under contract, only to find out that the seller of that property was not the actual seller of the property. So what we need to do for best practices is because in this day of technology, oftentimes we don't sit around the kitchen table and sign paperwork like we used to. But I dare say that you should make sure that part of your protocol when you are listing a property, and this goes for buyers too, if you're working with a buyer, make sure you see their driver's license. I'm in the middle of a lawsuit right now where we sold a property back in 2022, I guess. And the seller of the property had the same name as his deceased father. And one was a junior and one was the third. And his driver's license didn't say whether he was a junior or whether he was a third. And unfortunately, the listing agent was a distant cousin of this person, not knowing that side of her family. And the property was assigned to a different buyer and sold. And now suddenly an ex-wife appears out of nowhere a year later and claiming that we had no right to sell the property. So that's a case I'm dealing with right now. But, my concern to the attorney is that how could a closing attorney close this transaction without properly identifying who the seller was? And the seller, who wasn't really the seller, signed everything under his father's name as junior, and he was the third. So I'm hoping the way this case will fall out is that the closing attorney will have some fight in this and responsibility in closing this transaction. So I get a lot of calls about probate. And when you all list a property, we need to make sure that we are looking at the probate paperwork to make sure that the client that we're working with is really technically authorized to sell a piece of property. The same thing goes with buyers. I've had buyers who are habitual, and I don't know why they do this, but they go under contract on $1 million properties with no intention of purchasing them because they really don't have the cash to do so. So we got to really do our homework in identifying who we're working with, particularly now, because y'all know how many texts you get that says it's Tom, are you available? And it's not me. And so there's so much fraud going on in the world today. We have to, as real estate professionals, be very, very careful. And one of the sellers who was the actual seller and was being defrauded, they got really angry. It's like, don't y'all check driver's licenses? And so it's not uncommon for you to do that. And I even have now, I've reviewed some files, or I've reviewed a file over the weekend where they actually had a copy of the driver's license of the buyer of the property in their command file. And so I'm not saying that you need to do that, but all I'm saying is we need to verify who it is we're working with and are they legitimate, particularly if it's a probated property or a vacant property or a vacant lot. Any questions about that?
Hey, Tom,
Yes, ma'am.
the only thing I have to say about that is I've had that happen to me before too. And I was able to stop the transaction because I realized early on, because I get a copy of the identification from the buyers and the sellers. And this particular identification had the top of the gentleman's head cut off. So I knew that that was not a valid ID, because when you go to get your driver's license or your passport, they want your entire face and your head on that picture. It just
That's
so
correct.
happened when I went to discuss this transaction with Kimberly Mays in our office, the closing attorney, she happened to be the original closing attorney for the original seller. And when she pulled the documentation, the gentleman who was fraudulent looked a lot like the owner of the property, but we were able to stop that transaction very early. And there was somebody that was living in that home, and I notified her to not let anyone else in there because it was her and her children. That could have been very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So just be aware this is going on. I'm not trying to, freak anybody out, certainly, but just know that it's going on and we need to make sure we're doing our part to, and again, I think the client will appreciate your concern to verify their identity.
Tom, can I add one more thing?
Sure, Barbara.
When we have them to meet us at our office, brick and mortar, that provides more credibility because more than one person is going to see that person coming through the door. And if they're fraudulent, they're not going to want you to see who they are.
That's right. Well, and for your own personal safety, it's a really good idea to meet someone who you have no relationship with, that you get as a buyer or a seller to meet them at your office. I think it's a more professional way of handling it, and it's a safety precaution for you as an agent. All right, if there's no more questions or discussions about that, I'm going to move on to another topic that I'm dealing with quite a bit these days, and it's seller repairs. So when we negotiate repairs for sellers to do, if we're representing a buyer, or even if you are the listing agent and the seller has repairs to do, I am seeing stipulations where it says they need to be done 3 to 5 days prior to closing with receipts. And there is a lot of repairs that I get calls about that are not done within that time frame. Folks, that's a breach of contract. And so recently, I had an agent in the Buckhead office who called me, and I kind of walked them through what they needed to do. And the seller was supposed to have repairs done 3 days before closing, and they didn't. And I'm like, okay, well then we need to send, we can't just terminate the contract. Okay. We have to put anybody who's in default on notice. And y'all have heard me talk about the notice GAR form before, and it's a very underutilized form. And it's a form we should be using to notify folks when the buyer has applied for their loan. It's required in the convention, in the financing exhibits. It's required that we notify the seller when the buyer has applied for their loan. And so that's a good use of that form. But more importantly, in the case of this instance with repairs, we notified the seller that these certain repairs were not done. And we had a follow-up home inspection, and the home inspector went through the list item by item and said, this is done, this has not been done. And so we had evidence to support our notice. And so we sent the notice, we sent it with the list and a copy of the inspection, the re-inspect, and said, we need this done by 6 p.m., which was the day before closing. And they replied back, we cannot get it done by 6 p.m. On the day before closing. I'm like, okay, well, you're in breach of contract. And so I instructed our agent to go back and do their walkthrough, because they had the right to complete these repairs prior to closing, even though they've already hadn't done it 3 days prior. Now, Seth Wiseman, and we can get into a lot of discussion about this, but Seth Wiseman seems to think that if the repairs are done before closing, but they're not done 3 days before closing, that's sort of not material enough to be able to terminate a contract. I don't know if I agree with that or not. There's a reason we put that special stipulation in our agreement, but we still have to notify the party, and they have the right to cure the default. So, long story short, I instructed our agent to go to closing. They did the walkthrough. Closing was at 11. Everybody showed up. The repairs still had not been completed. The seller felt like he could get them done by 4 o'clock that afternoon. The attorney called me and said, what do you think? And I said, I have no confidence in the seller to do what they're supposed to do. They've had since July 17th to complete these repairs. This was like, I don't know, a week and a half ago when the closing was. So they had well over a month to get these repairs done. And granted, they weren't significant, but they were repairs that they agreed to do. So the buyer decided at that point that they were not going to close. And I supported that decision. So I had to wind up writing a 10-day letter. I still don't have, I'm sure I'm going to get some objection to that, because I got nasty phone calls after the buyer didn't close. But if a seller agrees to repairs, regardless of how insignificant it may be to them, they've agreed to it. It's important to the buyer. You as a listing agent need to follow up and make sure that happens. And especially if you're a buyer's agent, you need to make sure that happens. And if they don't perform, the buyer can back out of the agreement if they want to. So I always like, and I know that some buyers feel differently about this, but I always like to get a seller credit to for closing costs or a price adjustment, and suggest to buyers that I might work with that they get their own repairs done by their vendors, because if they're not done to their satisfaction, they know who to call afterwards. Most sellers are going to use the cheapest method available to them to get repairs done, and sometimes they're not of good quality. Now, that being said, the other thing that you need to write in your stipulation is that the repairs have to be done in a good with good workmanship, and the buyer has the right with an inspector to approve the repairs. So we need to have some leverage there for our buyers if the work is done shoddily, because if you don't address that in your special stipulation or in your amendment, then if they, are supposed to patch a wall and they patch it, but it's done really badly, you really don't have any recourse. So with everything in contracts, you need to have some kind of recourse for your client. That was a lot to take in. So tell me how y'all feel about that, and if you've had any problems, questions, issues, because it seems to be pretty widespread across the Heart of Atlanta group as an issue I get calls on frequently.
All right, Tom. So,
Hey, Lamar.
hey, so my concern is when you have a seller who has agreed to do certain things, be it certain repairs, or they've, I would say, let's say, misstated the HOA initiation fees and whatnot, right?
Yeah,
And
that happens quite a lot too.
right. So in a situation like that, we've negotiated repairs or costs and expenses, yada yada, closing costs, and then we get to a certain point where, let's say the buyer may have asked for certain repairs to be done, and then they they may have asked for something else, or then they may have asked for an extension on the appraisal. That comes up, right? So now the seller is at this point feeling like, okay, they're just constantly asking for this, asking for that, and I'm done. I'm not doing any more extensions. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not putting any more money or doing anything else with this deal. They're kind of like fed up. What happens now when they have agreed to do X, Y, Z, and they haven't done it, and they're like, well, I'm not doing anything else. Well, you agreed to do this already and you signed to it. No, I'm not doing anything else. They can back out if they want to, blah, blah, blah. Oh, I'm not selling the house. I'm not putting a dime into this anymore. They could just, whatever. I'm like, so what are the real choices that we have? I try to stay away from explain to them the legal ramifications, the consequences, because all they're going to do is get on the defensive, right? And I try to I make them upset. But what do you do, like, to encourage a seller to do what you said you were going to do? Because you said you were going to do it when you're representing the seller, right? And not sound like you're on the buyer side. You see what I'm saying? Like,
right.
That's where I found myself at least twice over the last couple of weeks. It's like, okay, I don't want to preach too much because now it sounds like I'm not representing my client. I'm more so on the buyer side, but you got to do the right thing now. Right is right, wrong is wrong. So how do you?
Right. Yeah. You have to be very careful how you approach that if you're representing a client, because you always want to be on the same side of the table as they are. And I think that, well, we all know there's unreasonable people, period. And there's just no reasoning with them. And there's no way around that at that point. But I would just say that, this is what you agreed to do. And failure to do it is a breach of a contract. And, you know, this is a legal binding instrument, and, you know, you've agreed to do it contractually. Now, that's
Okay.
probably as far as I would go if I'm representing this person.
Yeah.
And the buyer has the buyer has the option, if the seller hasn't done what they've contractually agreed to do, the buyer has the option of terminating the contract and retaining their earnest. But I think that we need to have a conversation with our seller that, you know, failure to do this is going to force the potential of you having to put your house back on the market. The same issues are going to surface. They're not going to go away. And now you may have longer days on the market, and you also may be looking at a price decrease. So I think there's some reasoning there that we as professionals have to have a conversation with our clients about. And I mean, even, you know, sometimes buyers will say, okay, what they didn't do is going to cost $1,500. And maybe it's best just to go ahead and close on the property, because now my 6.25 interest rate will be 7.5 if I have to go back out and buy another home. So I think we just have to make sure our sellers feel that we are on their side, but we also have to explain the consequences of, and make sure when they sign a document that they understand what they're getting themselves into. And I'm not sure that we do that as thoroughly as we should.
I think what I'm going to do, so that I can at least learn from this experience, that I think what we should do as a listing agent is make sure when they sign that HOA community form and that blank spot on there where it asks for what is the initiation, transfer, and admin fees, that they take the time to check, because their memory, they've lived in this house for, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years. They may not remember, or they may not be up to date on what those fees are now versus what they were when they bought. And they just
Right.
assume it's the same. So they just, you know, put
Yeah.
zero in there, they put whatever, you know, and that we have to explain to them that by law, if you disclose, or if you don't disclose that number correctly, it could come back to bite you at closing. And so that's what I have
Right.
a situation right now. Now, I was lucky enough to convince the buyer agent in this case to convince their client to go ahead and pay the fees, because they would have had to pay them anyway had we disclosed them their buyer fees. But she could have decided, no, I'm not paying it, because she didn't disclose it initially. And then, you know, we would have been just, you know, kind of stuck, because the seller at this point was just like, no, I'm not paying it. Well, you put zero in there. You should have put the right number. I'm not paying it. So I'm just happy it worked out the way it did, but it could have got nasty, and it could have just, you know, been a lose-lose.
I think we need to remind folks to really make sure they are validating what they're writing down, because things do change. And sadly, a lot of homeowners don't stay on top of the changes that affect their home. And they, so we need to remind them of that. That's a very, very good point. And sometimes I will also say that sometimes if you have a HOA, and this came up recently, where the HOA said, we're not going to sign the letter to release because you've got to paint your house. This comes up all the time at the last minute. So I usually encourage sellers who are under an HOA that they need to make sure they check with their HOA if there's any outstanding issues before they put their house on the market, because we don't want to wait, a couple of days before closing, only to find out there's an issue and you got to have your house painted. That's been a big issue.
My next question,
Lamar.
my next final question. Oh, yes, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, sometimes what I'll do is get the information from the seller early about the community association and who their the management company is, and send an email to the management company and copy the actual seller and ask the questions. The initiation fees, transfer fees, confirming what the HOA is, so that way they can fill that information out, to the best of the ability.
Okay. Yeah, I've even gone as far as like calling them myself, but then part of me feels like, okay, I might be leaving myself open for some liability if I go back and report to the seller, well, this is what they said. So put that in the blank. You know what I mean? Like I like that.
You got to be very careful about that, Lamar. Yeah,
keep
that's a
everybody
good point. Got to be very careful. That's
why
these
email
forms are for sellers to fill out. Okay.
Yeah.
It's their disclosure. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's our responsibility to find out that information for them, because it does set up some liability for you as an agent.
Right.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And because you're right, at the top of the document, it says it's the seller's responsibility. So like what Joel said about the email, but at the end of the day, the seller is not off the hook. It is the seller's responsibility to get that accurate information to us, because even if they're not staying in touch with their homeowner association, they could be giving you bad information just based off of the last assessment that they just happened to look at. But it is absolutely the seller's responsibility, and we don't want to set ourselves up for liability, because they're going to come back and they're going to say, well, I didn't put that information in there. Joel got that information, but Joel got the information from that seller.
Yeah, well, I let them. That's why I copied the seller on there, so the seller can fill out the HOA information, because I don't fill that out. That's up to them. Right. I just try to get the information that they're going to need, and I try to, and they don't know. Sometimes they don't know what to ask for. Like, is there initiation fee? Is there a transfer fee? They don't know that, so I just try to help out the process. And then once the information comes back, they fill it out. And then it's like you said, it's their responsibility to take care of that. We just try to get them in the right conversation.
That's right.
But Tom, I was going to say that it almost every single listing, this is what I know, the closing attorney will tell you as well, that on that HOA document, we explain to every seller, listen, this number, which is the transfer fee, if you do not know it, or if you get it wrong, it comes on, you have to pay it at the closing every time. Right. So I say that on every listing, and what I find is that seller finds that information and they find it correctly.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to pay it. Period.
Right. Well, it's to their benefit. And honestly, I think coming from a place of contribution with our clients is where we should be coming. And they appreciate it, because like you said, they don't want to have any surprises at closing, and they don't want to come up with any other fees that they have to pay. And so it's really to their benefit in every single way to verify all of that information before they put it down and convey it to a buyer.
Yeah, I totally agree, because you have like in a perfect world, like Yolanda said, if the seller doesn't want to pay those fees, then they're going to do their due diligence and find the right information. But it doesn't happen all the time. In a case like mine, where they kind of rush through the forms, and DocuSign and .loop is all easy to just kind of loop and rush through, and lots of times they don't take the time to do what they need in order to make sure they got the right information on there. They just put something in there, although you would do all that explaining in the beginning, but then they get amnesia when it bounces back on them. So, well, because you did not put the amount in there, you put 0 instead. The closing letter says it's 1,500. So now you have amnesia. Well, no. I couldn't have put that. Well, no, it's right there. That's your handwriting, right? And so, yeah. I like the strategy that Joel suggested, so that everybody is on the same accord. It's right there. Everybody knows what's what, and you got the paper trail.
Exactly. Everything in writing. And that way you don't have to worry about it. So. All right, guys, we've got like a minute left. Is there anything else that you all want to talk about? I do want to remind you of your favorite topic, and that is board dues. They are due October 1st. So you've got about 2 weeks to get those paid. And if you don't have the money to do it, I would call the board and see if they are still offering a payment plan and put it into 4 monthly payments. But we need everybody to get their board dues paid, because we are realtors and we abide by a code of ethics, and we are benefit from being a realtor. So make sure you get those paid. Anybody else have anything before we adjourn today?
I just want to say, Tom, that at Metro South, we do have a payment plan,
Mhm.
and this will be the last year we're offering it too.
Okay. Good to know. All right, guys. Well, listen, as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me and Deborah Blue on these calls. I hope they're informative. We feel that we're bringing topical topics to you to help you be a better agent. And I just appreciate you taking the time to join me here today. So until next time, have a great week. Sell lots of houses. And if you need me, call me.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Always. Thanks, Tom.